A quiet man in faded jeans was told to leave first class. No one checked his name. Minutes later, $500 million, 0 cents, vanished from the stock market. What the airline didn't know was they had just insulted their owner. And what he did next shook the aviation world to its core. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The terminal at JFK buzzed with polished chaos. Heels tapping like clocks on marble floors, voices rising and falling between boarding calls, and overpriced espresso cups perched on designer luggage. Travelers moved with purpose, briefcases and boarding passes in hand, every step signaling status. No one paid attention to the man in the dark gray canvas jacket who walked calmly through it all. Keanu Reeves carried no entourage, no designer tags, no commotion. Just a scuffed leather satchel over his shoulder, a folded boarding pass in hand, and a presence that settled instead of shouted. His boots were worn but clean, his black jeans had seen better years. The faded navy shirt under his jacket clung loosely to a frame that looked comfortable in stillness. He moved like a man who belonged anywhere and needed no one to tell him so. The boarding pass read, Atlantic Air Flight 447 to Zurich, Seat 1A, First Class. Printed neatly under the barcode was the name, K. Charles. He approached the gate quietly. The agent behind the podium didn't look up as she took his pass. Her fingers scanned it in a practiced motion, her voice dry from repetition. First class is straight down and to the left. No eye contact, no smile, no recognition. Keanu nodded once and walked toward the jet bridge. No offense taken. No reaction given. But that moment stayed with him, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. As he entered the aircraft, the difference was immediate. Atlantic Air's flagship international cabin glowed with warm lighting and understated luxury. Dark wood panels, stitched leather dividers, and private suites enclosed in polished brass trim. Each seat was its own small kingdom. He stepped into first class and glanced at the placards. Row 1, Seat A, directly ahead, but someone was already sitting there. The man occupying Seat 1A lounged with the ease of ownership. Mid-50s, tailored slate suit, salt and pepper hair cut sharp around the temples, a glass of champagne in one hand, the other casually scrolling through something on his phone. He didn't even glance up when Keanu approached. Keanu looked again at his boarding pass, then turned toward the nearest attendant. A tall blonde woman moved briskly toward him, balancing a tray of rose. Her name tag read, Natalie. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice low, steady. "I believe this is my seat." Natalie gave him a glance, quick, clinical. "I'm going to ask you to step aside for just a moment," she replied, shifting the tray on her palm. "There's been a last-minute adjustment. That seat has been reassigned." She didn't ask for his name. She didn't check the pass in his hand. She just smiled, that thin, practiced smile, the kind that wasn't meant to invite questions. Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity. "I wasn't informed of any change," he said evenly. "This seat was paid for. Confirmed." Natalie lowered her voice as if doing him a favor. "We received a priority request from one of our Platinum Legacy clients. We're asking for your cooperation today, sir." He gestured toward the front of business class. Row 17. The leather recliners were still plush, the food still gourmet, the price still steep, but it wasn't 1A. Not in comfort, not in proximity, and not in meaning. Keanu's eyes drifted back toward the man in 1A, still relaxed, still oblivious, or pretending to be. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash a card or quote a clause. He didn't even sigh. He gave Natalie a single polite nod. Of course. He turned and walked toward business class, his satchel brushing against his leg. Behind him, no apology followed, No reconsideration, just the soft click of polished shoes moving back toward the first-class galley. But something had changed. Not in Natalie, not in the investor in 1A. Something had shifted inside the man now, taking seat 17C. Seat 17C was comfortable enough, not cramped, not tight, but it wasn't 1A, and it wasn't what he'd paid for. Keanu placed his satchel beneath the seat, smoothed his jacket, and sat down quietly. The space around him buzzed with the low rhythm of pre-flight rituals. Bags settling, seatbelts clicking, the whir of power systems cycling through cabin checks. 2 rows ahead, a woman leaned toward her husband, her whisper sharp and swift. "Maybe he used points," she said. "They've been lax with upgrades lately." Her husband didn't even look up from his tablet. "Or maybe he won a contest," he muttered. "Looks like one of those down-on-the-luck artist types. Brooklyn or something." Keanu didn't react. He'd heard worse in his lifetime, in boardrooms, on red carpets, in hotel lobbies where people assumed without asking, and here, 30,000 feet below, cruising altitude, he felt it again. He leaned back, staring ahead at nothing in particular. They hadn't seen him. Not really. They'd looked at the canvas jacket, the worn satchel, the scuffed boots, and decided everything they thought they needed to know. His name hadn't mattered. His boarding pass hadn't mattered. The decision had been made before he ever spoke. Behind the judgment, something deeper echoed. A belief that status is visible, that power wears labels. That anyone dressed like him couldn't possibly belong at the front of the plane. Keanu breathed slowly. He didn't reach for his phone right away. He didn't scribble notes in the black notebook tucked into the side pocket of his jacket. Instead, he simply watched. From the corner of his eye, he saw the first-class curtain still open, just long enough to see Natalie laughing softly while pouring another glass for the man in 1A. And that's when it clicked. The name, Martin Langford. He recognized the face now, a headline, a video clip from a tech panel 2 years earlier. Langford, founder of a data firm turned venture capitalist, had once gone viral for a single quote. "Diversity is good for branding, but it kills margins." He never apologized. And now here he was, grinning in seat 1A, sipping champagne that should have been someone else's, while the man who paid for it sat 20 rows behind. Keanu tilted his head slightly, took out his phone, and opened a locked folder. Inside was a single black screen with a blinking cursor. Protocol, Clause 7C. Status, ready. Trigger reason, operational ethics breach. He didn't tap anything, not yet. He looked up. Across the aisle, a young boy no older than 8 sat beside his mother. The boy wore a soft hoodie and clutched a plush stuffed animal shaped like a tiger. His eyes were wide, curious, focused on Keanu. He leaned toward his mother and whispered something. The woman, a black woman in a navy sweater, followed his gaze and smiled faintly, uncertain. The boy whispered again, "Is that Neo?" The mother looked closer. Her smile deepened, faint but knowing. Keanu gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just enough. The boy lit up. Moments later, a flight attendant passed their row. She skipped the blanket service on their side. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just moved on. The mother didn't say a word. She straightened her back and adjusted her son's blanket herself. Keanu noticed, and so did she. Their eyes met. She gave a nod, not just of greeting, but of understanding. "You're not the only one." The plane's doors sealed. The jet bridge pulled away. Cabin lights dimmed into a golden glow. Keanu reached for his phone once more. He stared at the screen. Clause 7C. Ethics trigger, ownership, level, protocol. He remembered the way Natalie hadn't checked his name. He remembered the smirk on Langford's face. He remembered the silence from every nearby passenger as he walked to 17C. But mostly, he remembered the boy's voice. Where did they make him move? Keanu's thumb hovered over the button. Then he pressed it. The screen blinked. Command confirmed. No lights flickered, no announcements played. Nothing changed for anyone around him. But far above the cabin, far across the ocean, a signal had just reached Zurich. And deep inside Atlantic Air's compliance system, red alerts began to flash. He folded his phone quietly, placed it inside the satchel at his feet, and leaned back in his seat. This flight wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The hum of the aircraft deepened as Atlantic Air Flight 447 began its taxi. Passengers adjusted blankets, pulled out devices, and ordered drinks. The first-class curtain had closed softly, hiding its glowing cabin behind a veil of stitched fabric. But the feeling lingered. The unspoken hierarchy still breathed through the aisles. Keanu sat in 17C, his back upright, his movements deliberate. Across the aisle, the little boy who had whispered Neo earlier was now coloring with a set of crayons pulled from a small backpack. His mother, still composed, watched the flight attendants carefully. Twice they had walked by without so much as a glance. No water, no welcome. Just averted gazes and empty gestures. 2 rows ahead, the same woman from earlier leaned again toward her husband. "Still surprised they let someone like that into business," she murmured. "Guess they'll sell those seats to anyone these days." Her husband gave a half snort. He probably redeemed 1,000,000 airline miles or something. That, or he's a musician. Those types always look rough. A businessman across the aisle chimed in with a chuckle. "Looks like a guy who writes poetry in his spare time and lives off energy bars." Keanu heard all of it. He didn't move. He didn't react. But each word was recorded. In memory, in awareness, in clarity. From the outside, it might have seemed like he was ignoring them, but the truth was sharper. He was listening. Every syllable told him more about the air he breathed, the cabin he occupied, and the reflexes of the people who assumed he was no one. It wasn't personal. That was the most dangerous part. It was structural. Polite voices masking quiet contempt. Soft voices delivering sharp dismissals. Casual comments that sliced without breaking skin. The mother beside the boy reached up to press the flight attendant button. She waited. A minute passed. Then another. Eventually, a young male attendant approached. Evan, nervous, freshly trained. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked. She spoke clearly. "Could we have a blanket, please, and some water?" Evan nodded. "I'll see what we have available." He left quickly, too quickly. The woman leaned back. She didn't sigh. She didn't scowl. But the tension in her body was visible to anyone willing to look. Keanu looked. She met his eyes. Again, a nod passed between them. Not pity. Recognition. Amara's coloring continued. She drew a figure with a long coat and sunglasses, standing in front of a plane. Her mother said softly, "He watches everything, doesn't he?" Keanu gave the slightest smile. "I always have." He reached into the side of his satchel, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen twice. The locked screen from before reappeared. Black background, single blinking cursor. Protocol, Clause 7C. Status, pending authorization. His thumb hovered. He hadn't pressed confirm yet. But the cabin was already changing, and everyone else was still pretending not to notice. A subtle vibration buzzed through the floor as the aircraft began climbing into the sky. The cabin lights shifted to a softer glow, and overhead bins settled after their last jostle. People relaxed into their seats, but the unease in business class hadn't left. Keanu lowered his gaze to the locked phone in his lap, the dark screen still displaying the option to trigger Clause 7C. He hadn't made his decision lightly. The protocol wasn't designed for anger. It was built for moments exactly like this, when systemic failure masqueraded as professionalism, when appearance outweighed truth, when dignity came second to assumption. Across the aisle, the boy tapped his mother's arm. "Is he going to do something?" he whispered, nodding slightly toward Keanu. His mother glanced at Keanu, then back to her son. "Well, already is." Evan returned quietly with a blanket and 2 small bottles of water. He smiled nervously as he handed them over, as if aware he was arriving late to something important. The mother gave a polite nod, but didn't thank him. It wasn't unkind. It was intentional. A boundary had been crossed, and this wasn't a reward. In the seat in front of Keanu, a man reclined suddenly, nearly knocking into his knees. He adjusted the tray table, unwrapped a protein bar, and turned on a movie without a word. The movement felt unconscious, but it wasn't harmless. Another assumption, another signal, another quiet reminder of what the cabin expected from the man in the faded jacket. In first class, just 20 feet forward, Martin Langford was telling a story to a young executive seated beside him. "And then I told the board, if they want to sell to that market, go ahead. But don't ask me to invest in a fantasy about equal access. That's branding, not business." The woman beside him gave a tight smile and sipped her wine. She didn't respond. Langford took another gulp of champagne and tapped the base of his empty glass, signaling for a refill. Back in 17C, Keanu heard the chime. He had no interest in the man's voice, but the volume of arrogance didn't need to be loud to travel. He adjusted in his seat, still not speaking. The screen in his hand blinked again. Clause 7. C. Ownership Override Protocol. Activated only in cases of operational ethics breach. Once confirmed, alerts would be sent to Zurich Legal, Atlantic Air Corporate, and the Volta Capital Board. It was irreversible. It required no approval. Keanu's finger hovered. He remembered Natalie's tone. We had a last-minute change. He remembered how she never asked his name. He remembered the man in 1A sipping champagne as if he'd bought the plane himself. He remembered the boy beside him, the mother beside him, the glances, the whispers, the way silence had wrapped around the injustice like packaging. He breathed in. The air smelled like linen, metal, and judgment. He pressed his thumb to the screen, but didn't confirm. Not yet. The signal had been sent, but he was still giving the system one last chance to see itself. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, the fastened seatbelt sign blinking off with a soft tone. The cabin crew began their rounds, offering drinks to the front rows, handing out menus to passengers with platinum status, and giving the rest a smile that never quite reached their eyes. Keanu sat still in 17C. His seatbelt was still buckled. The tablet in his lap remained untouched. The phone in his hand had dimmed, but the screen was ready. Clause 7, C still armed, still waiting. Across the aisle, the boy glanced at him again. "Mom," he said softly. "He's not doing anything." His mother smoothed his hair gently. "Sometimes doing nothing is the loudest thing you can do." The boy looked confused. She just gave a small, tired smile and kissed the top of his head. A few rows behind Keanu, a businessman with silver cufflinks leaned across the aisle to whisper to his companion. "That guy, the one in 17C. Didn't he try to sit in first class earlier?" His companion nodded. "Yeah, got bumped. Probably bought the wrong ticket and didn't want to admit it." A pause. "Still, he looks familiar." Another pause. "Don't they all?" Keanu heard every word. His eyes didn't flicker. His breath stayed even. He opened the notebook from the seat pocket in front of him. Inside, he wrote 3 lines. Protocol armed. Observed bias pattern confirmed. Civil escalation denied. He capped the pen, closed the book, and returned it to the pocket. The woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, peering between seats. She gave Keanu a long look, one that wasn't hostile, just uncertain, as if trying to match his face to a name, a memory, a movie. Then she turned back to her magazine, and the silence resumed. In the galley ahead, Natalie checked her reflection in the glossy glass panel of a storage cabinet. She adjusted her scarf, reapplied a quick dab of lipstick, and glanced at her service tablet. Nothing alarming yet. She hadn't received the notice from Zurich. Not yet. She still believed the flight was going exactly as planned. She still believed she was in control. Back in 17C, Keanu looked at his phone one last time. The screen awaited a single tap. Confirm activation? Yes. No. He pressed yes. The screen went black, and far away, in a legal office nestled inside a sleek Zurich tower, the system began to blink. A red alert appeared on a monitor no one expected to light up mid-flight. One name glowed beneath the alert. K. Charles? Volta Capital, verified stakeholder authority. And yet, 38,000 feet above the Atlantic, no one else on Flight 447 knew. Not yet. They didn't know the man in 17C had just changed everything. Believe they would. The tap of Keanu's thumb had been quiet. No dramatic sound, no change in cabin lights, no sudden announcement over the intercom. To anyone watching, it looked like a man adjusting his screen brightness or checking an email. But that moment sent a silent signal into the arteries of a global infrastructure, and its pulse was just beginning to register. Clause 7C, activated, confirmed, irreversible. Back in the cabin, the hum of the engines was uninterrupted. Tray tables clicked into place, drink carts rolled down the aisle. Natalie poured a third glass of champagne for the man in seat 2A, still smiling in that curated way she had perfected over years in the sky. Martin Langford swirled his glass with the confidence of someone who believed the world moved for him. He tapped at his smartwatch, scrolling through messages. Then, without prompting, he leaned toward the woman beside him and laughed. "You know what I miss? The days when first class meant privacy," he said. "Now, it's like a charity bus up here. You never know who they'll seat next to you." The woman gave a tight-lipped smile, eyes flicking toward the curtain that separated them from the rest of the cabin. Martin kept going. "Honestly, I'm not even mad they moved that guy. I'm just surprised they did it so quietly. Usually people like that make a scene." From his seat in 17C, Keanu could hear every word. The space between first and business wasn't soundproof, and ignorance, as always, traveled well. He didn't move, didn't blink, just waited. 2 rows back, Evan stood at the service station. The junior attendant checked his tablet for the 4th time in 2 minutes. A small red alert had pinged once, then vanished. But it was enough to pull at the edges of his curiosity. Crew alerts didn't usually ping mid-air unless it involved turbulence, rerouting, or a major tech failure. And this one had a code he didn't recognize. Clause 7C. He frowned. "Hey, Bryce," he whispered to the lead flight supervisor beside him. "Did you see this?" Bryce was checking champagne inventory. He didn't look up. "It's probably just a crew message. Refresh and ignore." But Evan didn't. He refreshed again, and this time the red ping didn't vanish. Clause 7C. Compliance review triggered. Secure protocol active. Evan stared at the screen. His training hadn't covered this, at least not in detail. Clause 7C was listed in the Emergency Systems Manual under Ownership Level Oversight, the kind of clause reserved for board members. Stakeholders, people who didn't just ride planes, they funded them. He glanced toward 17C. Keanu sat quietly, no expression, no attention drawn. But Evan's stomach tightened. Something was happening. And he had a feeling the man in that seat wasn't just another disgruntled traveler. Thousands of miles away, in a Zurich compliance center, the silence was broken by a high-pitched ping. System alert, Clause 7C activated, Stakeholder K. Charles. Elena Weiss, the night shift compliance officer, leaned in toward her monitor. She had been reviewing a case file involving baggage claim fraud, but this was something else. The 7C protocol wasn't supposed to fire mid-flight. It hadn't been triggered in over 5 years. She checked the attached metadata: aircraft ID, live coordinates, passenger manifest. Atlantic Air Flight 4147. En route from JFK to Zurich. She clicked open the live report feed and froze. The trigger authority showed as verified, thumbprint encrypted, accessed from row 17C. Passenger, K. Charles. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, connecting with Atlantic Air Legal in New York and the Zurich command bridge simultaneously. A red line blinked on the screen. Clause 7C is active and escalating. Within 90 seconds, 3 department heads were online. What the hell is Clause 7C doing live during an active flight? Someone asked. I didn't think it could even be activated in air, another said. Check the name again. Who is K. Charles? Back in 17C, Keanu closed the black notebook resting on his lap. His phone was silent now. No further prompts, no signals. Everything was already in motion. His expression was steady, measured, like someone watching the final minutes of a chess game he already knew he'd win. Across the aisle, the boy clutched his stuffed tiger again and whispered, "Mom, why didn't anyone stand up for him?" His mother blinked slowly, like the weight of that question had settled into her spine. "I don't know," she said. But the truth was buried in the tone of the cabin. No one had stood up because the offense had been dressed in etiquette. The humiliation had been handed out with smiles, and the punishment had been wrapped in polite language and professional distance. Natalie appeared near the galley again, her tray now empty. She checked her own tablet for upcoming meal service alerts and paused. A single red banner stretched across the top of her screen. Execute compliance monitoring initiated. She frowned and tapped once. The screen refused to respond. She tapped again. Nothing. "Bryce," she said under her breath. "I think something's wrong with the system." He walked over, glancing at the tablet in her hand. Then his own tablet buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, swiped up, and froze. Compliance alert. Level 7. Zurich activated. His face drained of color. Natalie looked at him. "What's level 7? Rice stared toward business class. "I think we just moved someone we shouldn't have." Bryce's fingers trembled as he scrolled deeper into the alert. The name flashing across every line of the activation feed was now unavoidable. Okay. Charles, verified ownership access, Clause 7C, initiator. He looked toward the rear of first class, then past the curtain into business. His heart dropped. Seated calmly in 17C, Keanu was still as glass before the wind hits. No motion, no reaction, as if he wasn't the center of an unraveling storm. Bryce whispered under his breath, "Oh no." Natalie leaned closer. "What did you say?" But Bryce didn't answer. His mind was racing through training protocols he had skimmed years ago, not believing they would ever apply. Clause 7C wasn't just an alert, it was a system override, initiated only by private stakeholders with controlling interest in the company. Stakeholders like the man they had bumped to row 17C without ever checking his name. Natalie followed his gaze and frowned. "Wait, you mean him?" Bryce nodded, pale. "Zurich's confirming it right now." Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Martin Langford took another sip of champagne and muttered, "This airline needs a reset. They're handing out upgrades like candy. Soon we'll be flying with TikTok influencers in here." The woman beside him gave a half-hearted chuckle but looked away quickly. Uncomfortable, embarrassed, Keanu sat, hearing it all. In front of him, a businessman minimized his spreadsheet and opened Twitter. He paused as he saw a trending post. A college student seated 3 rows back had uploaded a short video. A shaky clip of Keanu being politely redirected from first class. The caption was simple. Flight just bumped Keanu Reeves out of seat 1A for some Wall Street guy. Flight 447. It was already at 80,000 likes and climbing. The man's eyebrows raised. He turned to his seatmate. Hey, did you see this? That was Keanu Reeves in first class. They kicked him out. A few passengers nearby began checking their phones too. The energy in the cabin shifted, subtle but real, a ripple of awareness, a tightening in the air. At the same time, in Zurich, Elena Weiss opened a secure document, Volta Capital's latest equity structure in Atlantic Air. Her eyes scanned until they landed on a name buried deep in the filing. K. Charles, silent partner, Volta Capital, 48%, controlling stakeholder. Her breath caught. She reached for the phone and called New York. Illegal, get the CEO, now. Back on board, Keanu finally glanced down at the mother across the aisle. She was watching him now, her son asleep on her shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He nodded once. Not in triumph, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. Because the system that had tried to move him was now shifting beneath its own weight. And the man in 17C hadn't said a word. Bryce stood frozen by the galley, gripping his tablet like it might fall apart in his hands. His eyes flicked back and forth between the screen and the business class curtain. The name wasn't fading from the alert feed. If anything, it had now appeared in a second system. Volta, verification confirmed. He leaned back against the counter and exhaled sharply. Slowly, it was all coming together. K. Charles, the man in 17C, the passenger they had moved without checking credentials, the one who hadn't raised his voice once, yet somehow triggered an internal protocol no one on the aircraft could override. Natalie stepped into the galley, balancing a tray of tea service. She set it down and sighed. I swear, that guy in 1A is on some kind of power trip, she muttered. Told me not to seat anyone next to him before he even boarded. Acted like he owned the airline. Rice didn't respond. Natalie rolled her eyes, still flipping through the updated VIP roster on her screen. I don't see his name anywhere under Ultra Executive Platinum, probably another hedge fund dinosaur flashing fake influence. Rice looked at her, slowly. You have the business class manifest on your tablet? Natalie blinked. No. Why? Open it, Bryce said, voice low and tight. Natalie tapped through the system until she reached the roster. It was auto-filled from check-ins, security clearances, and booking history. She scrolled until she reached row 17. Passenger, K. Charles. Alias, K. Reeves. A private stakeholder, Volta Capital. Owner, 48% controlling interest Atlantic Air Holdings. She stopped breathing for a moment. You've got to be kidding. Bryce shook his head. Clause 7C was confirmed 15 minutes ago. Zurich compliance is on the line with corporate. Natalie backed up half a step. The tray behind her rattled. We bumped him for Langford? Bryce didn't nod. He didn't need to. It was already clear. Meanwhile, 2 rows back in Economy Plus, a college student named Maya Lynn refreshed her feed and nearly dropped her phone. She had posted a quick tweet just after takeoff, joking about the airline bumping someone from first class. Her caption read, "They kicked Keanu Reeves out of first class and gave his seat to a finance bro. Lol." The tweet now had over 80,000 likes and 12,000 retweets. Her mentions were flooding. Someone replied with a zoomed-in image of Keanu in 17C. Wait, that is him. Another added, plot twist, Keanu owns Atlantic Air. And then came the verification. A screenshot from an anonymous employee at Volta Capital. A clipped registry entry listing Keanu Charles Reeves as a silent controlling investor in Atlantic Air Holdings. The tweet ratioed itself in real time, and the internet erupted. But inside the cabin, Keanu was still in 17C, silent. His pen glided slowly across a page in his notebook. One line after another. Eyes saw, mouths stayed shut, patterns intact. Keanu's handwriting was deliberate, clean. Each line was a measured observation, a record of the invisible lines that had shaped his journey from gate to seat 17C. He wasn't recording for revenge. He was documenting something deeper. Patterns. People no longer saw because they had been normalized into silence. Across the aisle, the woman with the sleeping boy looked at him again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated, then pulled it out discreetly. Her screen lit up with a message from her sister. "Girl, are you on that flight with Keanu Reeves? Twitter is losing its mind." She blinked. Her fingers tapped rapidly, scrolling until she saw the post. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Keanu, seated quietly, her son's tiger on the tray, her own arm in the frame. The caption read, "Keanu got bumped, and he didn't say a word. This is what power looks like." Her mouth parted slightly, not in shock, but in realization. She turned toward Keanu again. He hadn't moved. He was watching the clouds through the window, calm and unreadable. From first class, laughter burst again. Martin Langford raised his glass, chuckling mid-sentence. And that's when I told them, "I don't mind charity, just don't ask me to sit next to it." Several heads turned in his direction. This time, the laughter was quieter, awkward, uneasy. Natalie returned to the galley, her face pale. She leaned into Bryce, whispering too fast. "It's going viral, right now. They're calling it the Seat 1A scandal." Bryce shook his head slowly. "It's not just viral, it's verified." Natalie looked down at her hands. "Does he know?" Bryce turned toward the curtain, then toward 17C. His voice came out low, almost reverent. "Hemingway knew before we did." In Zurich, the compliance floor was a battlefield of blinking monitors and incoming calls. Legal teams were coordinating with Volta Capital, scrambling to prepare a statement before the markets opened. The PR director paced a tight circle. "We've got one shot at this," she said. "If we don't move fast, this becomes a case study in every ethics seminar from here to Tokyo." "Too late," Elena muttered. "It already is." Back on the plane, Maya Lin was now trending across 2 continents. She refreshed her feed again. Flight 440, Seat 1A, Keanu Reeves. She'd posted another update. "Y'all, I saw it with my own eyes. They treated him like he didn't matter, and he just sat there, writing in his little notebook like a monk in a firestorm. Legendary." The woman across from Keanu took one last glance at the thread, then locked her phone and tucked it away. Her voice was quiet. "Thank you," she said, without looking directly at him. Keanu turned his head, just slightly. "No need." He opened a fresh page in his notebook and wrote one word at the top. "Exposure." In first class, the cabin had begun to grow still. Conversations slowed. Forks scraped plates more softly. Natalie's presence had shifted, shoulders drawn tighter, posture less composed. She hadn't touched her service tablet in 5 minutes. The screen was still frozen on one line. Executive monitoring engaged, stakeholder verification confirmed. She stepped back into the galley and leaned against the paneling, suddenly cold despite the cabin's perfect climate. Bryce glanced over. "Corporate legal is in contact with the cockpit," he said. "They're preparing for landing protocol, but they've made one thing clear." Natalie's eyes met his. "This man, Kay. Charles, he's not just an investor." He paused, swallowing hard. "He's the reason Atlantic still exists." The weight of that landed between them like a dropped tray. Meanwhile, back in 17C, Keanu set his pen down and folded the notebook closed. The boy across the aisle was awake now, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Keanu, confused. You're not mad?" he asked. Keanu smiled softly. "Why would I be?" The boy shrugged. "They were mean, and they didn't even say sorry." Keanu nodded. "I'm not here for sorry." The boy frowned. "Then what are you here for?" Keanu leaned forward just a bit. "Correction." A few rows ahead, a man had opened a financial news app on his tablet. The headlines were updating in real time. Breaking. Volta Capital, confirms stakeholder trigger event mid-flight. Atlantic Air, facing backlash. He turned to his partner, whispering, "It's him, that guy. He's the one who initiated the clause." "Which clause?" "Clause 7C, ownership level ethics override. It's like pulling the emergency brake on the company." Another passenger nearby overheard and leaned in. "Wait, he's the owner?" The man nodded. "Almost half the airline. Silent partner. Not so silent now." The woman who had been quietly watching Keanu closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "I just hope the people who judged him felt the shift." Maya Lin posted again. "This whole plane is quiet now, like they know they messed up. But they're too late. The lesson already landed." In the cockpit, Captain Harris had just finished a secure call with Zurich HQ. He exhaled long and slow, then turned to his co-pilot. "Update the landing notes. We'll be met on arrival." "Security?" "No, executive." He tapped the screen and opened the latest message. It was brief. "Respect, 17C. He represents the future." The pilot blinked. "Who's in 17C?" Captain Harris gave a small smile. "The quietest person on this plane." As the aircraft continued eastward, a ripple had become a wave. But Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He adjusted his seatbelt, looked down at the small journal in his lap, and wrote one final word for the section. Visibility. It was time the right people were seen. In a sleek glass tower in Zurich, the Volta Capital Command Room was glowing red. It began with a silent notification, then another, then 10 more. Every monitor in the compliance bay blinked in unison as trading terminals across the floor froze for a breath, then cascaded into action. "Clause 7C confirmed activation," one analyst said aloud. "Directive input accepted. Order queue unlocked." At the center console, the director of strategy gave a single nod. "Initiate Protocol Delta 4. Begin quiet divestment." Within seconds, Volta's automated trading systems began unloading millions of shares of Atlantic Air stock. Each transaction was quiet, legal, and invisible to casual observers. But the volume? It was impossible to ignore. 12% gone in the first 7 minutes. 27% by the 11th. At Bloomberg's Manhattan HQ, a red ticker broke through morning headlines. Breaking: Atlantic Air shares plunge 27%. Ownership clause triggered mid-flight. Back in the air, aboard Flight 447, the cabin remained visually unchanged. Passengers sipped drinks, flipped pages, adjusted blankets. But the air had thickened. Whispers floated like pollen through the cabin, clinging to every row. Natalie stared down at her tablet. The warning was no longer subtle. It pulsed across her screen in stark capital letters. Executive oversight engaged. Do not interfere. Beside her, Bryce leaned against the bulkhead, eyes locked on the same message. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The system had spoken for them now. "Has Zurich confirmed who he is?" Natalie asked, barely audible. "Yes," Bryce said. "The stake is real. 48%. They flagged it from both legal and strategy. He didn't just buy a seat on this plane, he bought the airline's soul." Natalie's face blanched. "And we moved him?" Bryce nodded. "We didn't check. We just assumed." Her voice cracked. "I didn't even ask for his name." "None of us did," Bryce replied. Down the aisle, Keanu remained still, in 17C. No phone in hand, no commands given. He had returned to silence, letting the system reveal its own failure. One row over, the mother with the quiet son looked around the cabin, then leaned toward him. "Something's happening," she whispered. The boy asked, "Like what?" She answered with a hush only the two of them could hear. "Consequences." Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Martin Langford was finishing another drink. "I'm telling you, they need to bring back exclusivity," he said to no one in particular. "The whole industry's gone soft, standards slipping. Everyone wants fairness, until it ruins first class." He chuckled to himself, glancing toward the closed curtain behind him. The guy didn't even put up a fight. Probably knows he got lucky even being allowed on board. That was the moment Bryce's earpiece buzzed. The pilot had just received a direct message from Zurich Legal. The voice on the other end was cold and clear. Tell your crew, Keanu Reeves is not to be moved, not to be questioned, and if anyone touches him again, the airline goes down with him. Bryce stood still, the message still echoing in his mind. His lips were slightly parted, but no words came. He looked over at Natalie, who was now pressing her hand over her mouth. Her tablet continued to pulse, every alert flashing brighter, more urgent. She whispered, "This can't be happening. This has to be a mistake." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. A second buzz hit Bryce's tablet. This time it wasn't Zurich. It was the airline's internal system flag, media volatility. Trending alert, Seat 1A, scandal, now surpassing 2 million mentions. Keanu Reeves plus Atlantic Air, market reaction underway. Keanu Flight 47 climbing across all social platforms. Natalie scrolled numbly. She tapped a headline link. Aired the employee. Bumped the plane the day Atlantic Air tried to bump its owner. Her hands trembled. She turned to Bryce. "I need to speak to him." "No," he said immediately, firm and absolute. "They said no one approaches him. We're being watched. Zurich is monitoring in real time. Legal is drafting a full release. Compliance is moving to contain the leak. And we—" He looked around at the polished wood and muted gold of the first-class cabin. "We are the leak." Langford let out a dismissive laugh from seat 10A, swirling his now half-empty glass. "You'd think people would stop whining about class by now," he said. "The world isn't fair, never has been. Get over it." He took another sip. "Some folks just don't belong in first class. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true." The woman seated next to him didn't respond. She hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, just stared forward, her shoulders slightly hunched, her breathing shallow. Langford didn't notice. Back in business class, the energy was beginning to thicken. Conversations lowered, eyes darted toward Keanu's row. Several passengers had read the news on their phones. A man in his 50s nudged his wife and whispered, "That's the guy. He triggered the stock drop." His wife gasped, covering her mouth. A student with a laptop had already posted a breakdown thread on social media. If you're wondering why Atlantic shares are falling and why a movie star is sitting in row 17C, buckle up. This is the thread you didn't know you needed. Keanu still hadn't moved. His fingers rested lightly on the closed notebook on his tray. His posture was relaxed, but the moment was anything but. The boy across from him whispered to his mom again. "Is he going to fix it?" She looked at Keanu, then at the closed curtain. "I think he already is." Inside the cockpit, Captain Harris stared at the message on his own flight console. The words glowed in green against a black background. "Maintain current seating, no crew contact. Passengers 17C under executive protection." He swallowed hard, then turned to his co-pilot. "Whatever happens next, stay out of it." 38,000 feet below, on the ground in New York, Atlantic Air's headquarters was in chaos. The executive boardroom, once sterile and composed, had erupted into a hive of open laptops, echoing phone calls, and panicked whispers. The CFO was on a call with Zurich. The CEO was pacing, holding his head with both hands as if trying to squeeze the problem out through his temples. "Do we have confirmation?" the CEO demanded. A compliance officer nodded grimly. "Yes, sir, it's Keanu Reeves. He's flying under the name K. Charles. Volta's 48% private equity stake was executed through a trust 6 months ago. It's..." Another executive muttered, "and we kicked him out of seat 1A. The room went dead silent. "No," the CEO said. "We didn't just kick him out. We embarrassed him. On the flight he owns, while he sat in silence." A new alert hit the digital boardroom screen. Atlantic Air, stock down 31%, Real-time watch list triggered. In the cabin, the turbulence light blinked on, though the air was still smooth. It wasn't the wind. It was the climate. Natalie stood near the jump seat, watching the passengers, her mind spinning. Every flight protocol she'd ever memorized was worthless now. None of it prepared her for this. And across the galley, Bryce was reading a new instruction on his device. Remain calm. Do not disclose stakeholder identity. Maintain standard passenger service. Full debriefing on landing. Natalie finally found the courage to ask, "Should we apologize?" Bryce shook his head. Too late. In seat 2A, Martin Langford yawned and stretched. He leaned back and looked around, smug and unbothered. "I still don't get what the fuss is. The guy didn't belong up here. If he was so important, we'd have known it." He chuckled. "Anyway, I'm sure he's enjoying his free wine and coach." The steward nearby clenched her jaw. She had read the viral post. She had seen the screenshots. She knew now exactly who was in 17C, and she knew Langford was spiraling into irrelevance faster than he realized. In business class, a quiet consensus had begun to form. People were no longer just scrolling. They were whispering apologies to each other, sharing theories, watching the curtain, the galley, and most of all, Keanu. He remained still, his notebook unopened now. His eyes were closed. Not asleep, just centered. The boy across from him nudged his mother. "Why is everyone looking at him now?" She brushed his hair gently. "Because they finally see him." He looked confused. "But he didn't do anything." She smiled softly. "Well, didn't need to." On the legal team call in Zurich, a director summarized the situation in one breath. Silent owner-activated executive clause. Triggered market dump. Seat reassignment confirmed discriminatory protocol. Stock collapse inevitable. One junior associate at the table muttered, "This might be the most expensive seat upgrade in history." No one laughed, because they were right, and the reckoning was just beginning. Bryce stood frozen just outside the galley, heart thudding in his chest. His hands were clammy, the tablet pressed against his side like it might slip out at any second. Every step toward row 17C felt heavier than the last. Each footfall sounded like a drumbeat beneath the quiet hush of the cabin. He passed the business class divider and entered a corridor of silence. Some passengers were still pretending not to notice. Others weren't even trying anymore. Heads turned, eyes tracked him. A few looked away the moment they realized where he was going. Bryce stopped at row 17. Keanu sat exactly where he'd been the entire flight. Posture relaxed, hands resting on his knees. No phone in sight, no journal open, just presence, centered, still. "Mr. Charles," Bryce said softly. Keanu looked up. "I wanted to..." He stopped. The words refused to form. There were too many of them, and none would be enough. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Yes?" Bryce swallowed. "I just need to confirm, on behalf of Zurich and legal, your identity. For the record." A pause. Keanu gave the faintest nod. "You already have." Bryce blinked. Keanu's voice remained calm. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Bryce. It's a mirror." Bryce felt his chest tighten. "Sir, if there's anything..." Keanu stood. No drama, no suddenness, just motion. And with that, he stepped into the aisle. The moment held. Passengers who had earlier scoffed at his boots, who whispered about upgrades and point schemes, now sat frozen in their seats. The air in the cabin thinned. Every eye was drawn toward the slow, steady figure, walking the aisle like it was a courtroom. Keanu didn't rush. He didn't need to. Each step back toward first class was a lesson, a correction, a moment of reckoning for every person who had assumed something about the man in black jeans and scuffed boots. One woman clutched her designer scarf tighter around her shoulders. Another man adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze dropping to the floor. The boy across from 17C turned to watch him go. His face was lit with wonder. "He's going back," he whispered. His mother nodded. "He never left." As Keanu walked past row 12, a man who had earlier muttered something about Brooklyn poets stared straight ahead now, cheeks flushed. By row 9, a woman who had posted a smug comment about downgraded standards pulled her phone quietly from the seat pocket and turned off the screen. By row 6, the student Maya Lin captured the walk on video, but didn't upload it. Not yet. Not this. This moment wasn't for performance. It was sacred. Keanu moved forward, steady as ever. And behind him, silence. Not of fear, of recognition. Keanu passed row 5. The aisle had become something else now. Not just a corridor between seats, but a timeline. Each row held a memory, a judgment, a look, a silence. The people in those seats shifted in their own ways. Some lowered their gaze. Others tried to smile weakly, hoping it might soften what they now realized they had participated in. He didn't look left, he didn't look right. He walked forward, not seeking apology, but showing them the truth of who he'd always been. A quiet man. A calm man. A man they hadn't bothered to know. At row 3, the woman who'd once whispered, "He must have used points," placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "I'm sorry," though it never left her lips. Keanu passed her without pause. He wasn't listening for confessions. Near the front of the cabin, Natalie stood frozen just outside the curtained first class, her back straight, tablet still tucked tightly beneath one arm. Bryce had told her to stay put, but she couldn't. The truth was written all over her now. Her breath was shallow, her face drained of the polish she wore like armor. As Keanu approached, she straightened and opened her mouth. "I didn't know," she said. Keanu stopped. They stood face to face now, no longer passenger and attendant. Just two people, with everything between them. "You didn't ask," he said simply. Natalie closed her eyes. The sting behind them was growing too sharp to blink away. "I thought I was following procedure." Keanu's tone never changed. "You were following expectation, not policy." Natalie's hands gripped the tablet tighter. "I was trying to make things easier." "For who?" The words hung in the air. There was no malice in them, no cruelty, just gravity. Keanu took a breath, then gently stepped past her and pushed open the curtain. First class sat in hushed stillness. Napkins folded, screens dimmed, champagne glasses still half gone. But no one touched them. Martin Langford was reclining in 1A, legs stretched comfortably, his third drink in hand. When he saw Keanu walking toward him, the smirk faded. Slowly, like a mask sliding off. "You again?" Langford muttered. "I thought they dealt with you." Keanu didn't answer. He stepped into the golden light of the cabin, now dimmed in every sense of the word. A space that had once judged his silence was now suffocating in its own. Langford tried again, scoffing. "Look, if this is about the seat thing..." "It's not," Keanu said quietly. He took one final step and stopped directly in front of 1A. Natalie had followed him inside. Bryce was now at her shoulder. Both crew members watched as Keanu placed a hand on the headrest of his original seat. He looked around the cabin once, and then, only then, did he sit down. 1A wasn't just reclaimed, and it was redefined. The seat gave slightly beneath him, but the weight it carried was immeasurable. Keanu adjusted the armrest, fastened the seatbelt, and sat, still, centered, unshaken. He didn't gloat. He didn't glance at Martin Langford. He didn't need to. Martin, on the other hand, squirmed. He shifted in his chair, then leaned sideways slightly, as if needing more space than the luxury already offered. But the discomfort wasn't physical. It was something else, something unfamiliar. The loss of false superiority. Keanu's quiet presence now filled the entire cabin. Langford cleared his throat and muttered, "It's just a seat." But even he didn't believe it. From behind the curtain, the cabin buzzed with awareness. The passengers in business class weren't just watching, they were recalibrating. Rethinking every moment, every joke, every stolen glance of judgment. Some began deleting tweets, others just sat in silence. Near the rear of first class, an older gentleman who had once been silent now leaned toward his wife and whispered. They had no idea who he was. His wife replied gently. They didn't care who he was until it mattered. Bryce stood frozen in the aisle, watching everything unfold. He had served this airline for over 20 years. He had flown celebrities, politicians, billionaires. He had handled crises, turbulence, even an emergency landing. But this was different. It wasn't loud. It was transformative. The cockpit door opened. Captain Harris stepped into the aisle, composed but visibly tight around the eyes. He approached the front row with the slow, steady caution of someone entering a courtroom. "Mr. Reeves," he said, voice measured, "I've just been briefed by Zurich. On behalf of the flight crew and this airline, I'd like to offer you our sincerest..." Keanu held up a hand. "No need for a speech, Captain." Harris hesitated. "Still, I want you to know, I didn't know who..." "I know," Keanu said, his voice soft but unshakable. "That's the problem." The captain nodded, humbled. "Yes, sir." Keanu turned slightly in his seat and looked around. His gaze swept over the faces that had judged him earlier, the ones who now stared at him with a mix of awe, shame, and silence. Then he said quietly, "This wasn't about me." Langford opened his mouth, trying to find words, but nothing came. Keanu continued, "This was about how quickly people are dismissed for not looking the part. How easily assumptions shape actions. Ruin cinches frog." His eyes settled on Natalie. "How many others did you move without checking?" Her throat tightened. She couldn't answer. Keanu leaned back, resting his head against the cushion. He didn't need to raise his voice. The point had already landed. And though the plane had yet to touch the ground, the impact was already global. Everyone in that cabin would remember this flight. Not for turbulence, not for delay, not even for the fallout, but for the walk of a man who never needed permission to be where he belonged. He just needed to be seen. The hush inside first class was deeper now. Not quiet in the usual luxury sense, but charged, like the air before lightning. Keanu's presence in seat 2A was no longer unusual. It was undeniable. Martin Langford fidgeted beside him. The man who had once lounged in the leather like a king now sat stiff, his knee bouncing slightly. He forced a scoff, trying to reclaim control. "So, what is this, a publicity stunt? You win your seat back and now you want a parade?" Keanu didn't respond. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and slowly pulled out a card. It was unlike anything Langford or anyone else had seen on a plane. Sleek, black, bordered in platinum. It bore no name. Just a crest. Sharp, unmistakable. The symbol of Volta Capital. Bryce, watching from 2 rows away, went pale. Natalie gasped, the sound escaping before she could stop it. Langford's mouth opened slightly. "Is that supposed to mean something?" Keanu held the card between 2 fingers, steady, deliberate. "It means," he said, his voice calm and clear, "you're sitting beside the man who owns nearly half of Atlantic Air." Langford froze. "I'm not here as an actor," Keanu continued, "and I'm not here as a passenger." He stood up, once again turning to face the cabin. "I'm here as a stakeholder, and I'm here to address what just happened, not to me, but through me." The tension in the air thickened like fog. Bryce stepped forward, trying to speak. "Mr. Reeves, sir, I assure you this wasn't..." "It was," Keanu interrupted gently. "It was exactly what it looked like." His gaze moved to Natalie. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't verify the boarding pass. You saw a man in quiet clothes and decided he didn't belong." Natalie's eyes welled. I didn't mean... You didn't think you had to, Keanu said, still soft, still composed. You followed prejudice disguised as protocol. A ripple passed through the cabin. Keanu turned slightly, projecting now, not with volume, but with conviction. Clause 7C was created for moments like this. Operational ethics violations. Patterns that go unnoticed because no one questions the assumptions they stand on. He lifted the card again and then returned it calmly to his jacket pocket. I've activated that clause. Zurich has confirmed. Atlantic Air is under full executive oversight. No one moved. Not Langford. Not the crew. Not the other passengers. Keanu returned to his seat. And this time, when he sat down in 1A, it wasn't a protest. It was a verdict. The verdict of a man who hadn't raised his voice, but had reshaped the entire cabin through the sheer weight of being. Keanu rested back into seat 1A with the calm precision of a man taking his rightful place, not just in leather, but in principle. His posture spoke louder than any outburst could have. And around him, the silence sharpened into something no luxury amenity could smooth over. Bryce stood near the galley, struggling to maintain composure. The man had spent years enforcing elite status systems, reward tiers, and exclusive privileges. He had enforced the airline's image with pride. But now he felt like a spectator to his own collapse. He cleared his throat and spoke toward the front. Mr. Reeves, we acknowledge the oversight, and I assure you the crew will be subject to a full... Keanu didn't look at him. His voice came quietly but firmly. It's not about punishment, it's about recognition. Bryce faltered. Keanu turned his gaze toward the passengers instead. This seat 1A, it isn't just a number. It's an assumption, a boundary, a symbol of who we think belongs where. He'd let that hang. For some of you, I wasn't supposed to sit here because I wasn't wearing the right shoes, or suit, or face. Natalie's face flushed as if every word undid one layer of confidence she had relied on. Langford tried again. Oh, come on, he muttered, waving a hand. You're blowing this out of proportion. It was just a seating adjustment. Keanu turned his head, slowly. A seating adjustment, he repeated. Made without verification, enforced without explanation, justified by the word platinum. Langford leaned forward. That's standard airline practice. Then the practice is broken. Gasps didn't erupt. No one clapped. But the truth cut sharper than applause ever could. From row 2, an older woman spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. I've flown this airline for 17 years, she said, and I've never questioned how first class was chosen. She looked at Natalie, then Bryce, then Keanu. Now I will. Keanu nodded once. The woman continued. And I'm sorry for the silence, for being one of those who looked and didn't speak. A man across the aisle cleared his throat. Same here. Then another. We saw it happen. We all did. The cabin shifted. A reckoning not just for the crew, but for everyone who had sat in quiet agreement, complicit without words. Natalie's voice broke as she finally stepped forward. I thought I was doing my job. You were, Keanu said gently, but the job needs to change. She blinked, trying not to cry. Bryce stared at the carpet. The weight of corporate branding, policy books, and scripted training manuals suddenly felt paper thin. Keanu turned his eyes toward the closed curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane. No more barriers, he said. And with those 3 words, first class felt smaller, colder, and more exposed than it had ever been. Keanu reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the airline's glossy magazine again. He held it for a moment before flipping to a center spread featuring the Atlantic Air executive team. The photo beamed with polished teeth, custom suits, and a tagline that read, "Excellence above the clouds." He held it up briefly and looked around. This, he said, is who you think excellence looks like. This is what's printed and promoted. Then he lowered it gently. But excellence is also quiet. It wears worn boots. It gives people the benefit of the doubt, even when it hasn't been given any. He folded the magazine shut and placed it face down on the tray table. Langford, still seated beside him, fidgeted. The smug grin was long gone. He now sat hunched, red-faced, watching the man he had mocked take control of everything without ever raising his voice. "Is this some kind of moral crusade?" Langford muttered, more to himself than anyone. Keanu turned his head once more. "No, this is what correction looks like." Across the cabin, passengers leaned in, listening now not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. Some of them had whispered, some had laughed, some had ignored, but now, no one looked away. Rice cleared his throat from the front galley. "Mr. Reeves, Pair Zurich, we've initiated full review procedures. Immediate internal audit. Senior crew debriefing upon landing." Keanu nodded once. "Good. Let it start here." Natalie stepped forward, her voice soft. "And what about us?" Keanu turned to her. "You're not powerless, but you are accountable. From today on, your decisions carry weight, whether you feel it or not." She nodded, barely. "I understand." He turned to Evan, who stood just behind her. The junior flight attendant had been silent the entire time, but now took a cautious step forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "I wanted to say, I saw what happened. I should have said something." "You saw it," Keanu replied gently. "Now do something." Evan nodded with more conviction. "I will." Keanu reclined again, not as a man who had won something, but as one who had completed something. The seat didn't matter anymore. The message did. Outside, the clouds were breaking. The light beyond the window shifted as the plane moved forward. Somewhere beneath them, Zurich waited. Along with headlines, audits, boardroom chaos. But inside the aircraft, a new silence had taken hold. A silence filled with reflection, not guilt. Correction, not shame. Keanu closed his eyes. This was never about vengeance. Never about putting anyone in their place. It was about showing everyone who had forgotten what dignity actually looks like when no one expects it to speak. At Atlantic Air's corporate headquarters in Manhattan, the glass walls shimmered with mid-morning sun, but the mood inside the top-floor conference room was anything but warm. Screens flickered with flashing alerts. Phones rang, but no one picked them up. Every eye was locked on the massive display at the end of the room, where a blood-red ticker pulsed beneath the Atlantic Air logo. The stock was down fast. In just under 6 minutes, share value had dropped 18%. By the time someone from Zurich Legal patched into the emergency board line, it had slipped past 24%. A junior analyst, barely out of college, stammered into the silence, "Volta just liquidated every holding. It's a total pullout." The room spun. The CFO wiped his glasses and whispered, "That can't be right. We had assurances. Volta was locked until Q4. Clause 7C, someone said from the corner. The CEO turned sharply. "What?" "Clause 7C, the head of compliance repeated. Her voice was flat. "It's a trigger protocol built into our stakeholder charter, reserved for operational ethics breaches initiated by anyone holding 40% or more." The boardroom froze. "Who activated it?" the CEO asked. Her voice didn't waver. "Hey." Silence dropped like a storm cloud. A VP of partnerships leaned forward. "That's Keanu Reeves." No one spoke. They didn't need to. On the opposite wall, a Bloomberg headline refreshed in real time. "Keanu Reeves triggers $500 0 M fallout after airline insults owner mid-flight." CNN's banner followed seconds later. "Atlantic Air faces internal collapse after ethics clause activation." Then came the worst of it. Zurich Legal. A cold voice on the speaker said, "All merger conversations with Mad Air have been frozen. We are suspending all marketing activity. Every contract clause tied to goodwill, Equity behavior or operational optics is now in breach. Someone knocked over their coffee? It splattered across a printed campaign plan on the table. The page bled red. No one bothered to clean it up. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Flight 447 cruised calmly at 38,000 feet. But inside that aircraft, change had arrived. Phones that had remained in airplane mode were now lighting up. Just enough connectivity breaking through over the ocean to receive updates. Screens lit up. Notifications pinged. Quiet gasps filled the air like soft raindrops before a flood. A man in row 3 tapped his wife on the arm. "Look at this." A young woman in 5B covered her mouth as the news loaded. She turned to her seatmate, barely able to whisper, "That's him. He owns the airline." In business class, the young boy who had earlier whispered "Neo" to his mother now stared at his tablet with wide eyes. "Mommy, is this real?" His mother read the headline, stunned. She reached over and gently took the device, her throat tight. "It's real, baby." She looked up toward first class, and they didn't know. Keanu remained in seat 1A, undisturbed. His eyes were closed, but his posture remained upright, calm, controlled. He wasn't resting. He was remembering. Every decision, every silence, every slight he had let pass before this moment. He had once believed dignity was enough. Now he understood. It wasn't just about dignity. It was about consequence. Down the aisle, even the most aloof passengers were now shifting in their seats. One by one, they refreshed news apps, scanned headlines, scrolled through trending tags. The same story kept appearing. Same face, same number. Keanu Reeves triggers $500.00 M drop after being kicked out of his own seat. Clause 7C, the most expensive seat swap in aviation history. The magnitude was setting in. It wasn't just a celebrity moment. It was a corporate collapse unfolding in real time. And they were inside it. Natalie stood in the galley, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance. Her face had gone pale. The tablet in her hand blinked again. One final red line sealing the truth. Or K. Charles/verification. Complete/oversight act. She didn't move. She couldn't. Rice leaned against the wall, sweat beading under his collar. The man who had confidently recited safety procedures to hundreds of cabins now couldn't find the words for a single apology. His earpiece buzzed, but he didn't answer. There was no response he could give that would matter now. In seat 2B, Martin Langford sat frozen. His phone had finally connected to the in-flight network, and he was staring at the breaking news banner. He had made snide jokes, claimed the seat as his own, and publicly dismissed the man beside him. Now he couldn't even meet Keanu's eyes. The glass of champagne he'd been nursing all flight sat untouched. His hand trembled slightly. His confidence had unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing remained but the ugly skeleton of entitlement. Behind him, a passenger whispered, "That's him. That's Langford." Someone else murmured, "He's the one who took the seat." The whispers didn't get louder. They got quieter, sharper, more surgical. Judgment wasn't shouted. It was passed in silence now. For one row back, a woman typed a quick message. "Guy in 1A owns the airline. The man who mocked him is about to lose everything." She hit send. The tweet went viral before the aircraft even crossed Ireland. In the cockpit, Captain Harris received his final legal alert from Zurich. There was no debate left, no discretion. Flight 447 is now under executive audit. He nodded once, closed the screen, and stepped back out into the cabin. From seat 1A, Keanu looked up at him. "Mr. Reeves," the captain said, steady but subdued. "Zurich has confirmed your activation of Clause 7C. As of now, we are under direct compliance observation. Do you have any additional requests?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You already know what needs to happen." The captain gave a respectful nod. "Understood." He turned and walked back to the front. The cabin remained heavy with awareness. The lights had dimmed again, not by design, but by atmosphere. The tone had shifted, permanently. One by one, the people who had looked through Keanu earlier now sat with the weight of what they hadn't seen. Not a man in simple clothes, not a passenger in a misplaced seat, but the quiet force behind a decision that changed everything. And 37,000 feet above the world, that truth echoed louder than any engine ever could. Natalie sat stiffly in the jump seat behind the galley curtain, hands clenched around her tablet. Her name was glowing in dozens of notifications, too many to read, all impossible to ignore. Her cheeks were flushed, her chest tight, the fluorescent light above her somehow colder than it had ever felt before. She'd seen trending names before, celebrities, influencers, politicians. She had never imagined hers would join that list. Not like this. The image circulating the fastest wasn't the incident or the moment Keanu reclaimed his seat. It was a still frame of her standing next to seat 1A, gesturing downward, mid-sentence, eyes fixed on a man she hadn't bothered to identify. Under it, the caption read, "This is what judgment looks like before it checks a name." The comments were brutal, some cruel, others thoughtful, but the truth had already cemented itself. She hadn't just made a mistake. She'd made a choice. And now the internet had receipts. 2 rows ahead, Martin Langford stared forward, expression blank. The champagne was long gone. His phone, now silent in his hand, glowed with open tabs, market reports, texts from shaken investors, unread emails from his legal team. His face remained tight, but the panic behind his eyes said it all. On the screen in front of him, his portfolio had lost over $130 million, 0 cents, in just under 3 hours. The bleeding wasn't over. He swallowed dryly and didn't move. No one came to check on him. In the past, his title alone would have guaranteed attention. But now, passengers barely glanced in his direction. When they did, it was the kind of glance that stripped status from a man and replaced it with shame. Someone whispered, "Is that the guy who got Keanu kicked out?" No one answered. Langford shifted his weight, but it didn't help. There was nowhere to go. Back near the cockpit, crew tablets lit up with internal updates. Leadership. Review initiated, all incident reports to be submitted immediately. Accomplish investigation, in progress. Warning, delays in reporting will be noted in audit review. Bryce read it 3 times. He felt like the oxygen had thinned in the cabin, though the pressure hadn't changed. This was no longer about a bad judgment call. It was about the culture that let it happen so casually, so publicly, so predictably. He turned slowly and looked toward Keanu, now seated calmly in 1A. Keanu hadn't touched his phone in the last hour. He wasn't checking stock prices, wasn't responding to media waves. His world had narrowed to the small, leather-bound notebook in his lap and a pen resting loosely in his right hand. Page after page was filled with short, quiet thoughts. But now he was writing one final line, a phrase, a sentence, something that would close this chapter, not with a roar, but with resolve. Then he clicked the pen closed and set it aside. The notebook rested gently on Keanu's tray table. Closed. Final. He didn't need to underline the last line. It was already carved deeper than ink could go. Across the aisle, a man in business attire shifted uncomfortably. Earlier, he'd been among those speculating about Keanu's presence. He remembered his own words, something about contest winners. He hadn't meant harm, but now, in retrospect, he saw it clearly. That wasn't innocence, it was assumption. And assumption had a cost. It lived in every unchecked glance, every silent agreement, every moment where dignity was deferred to appearance. His eyes met Keanu's briefly, then dropped. A row behind him, a college student had stopped scrolling. The story was still trending, her phone buzzing in her lap, but what struck her most wasn't the headlines. It was the expression on the man in seat ton A. Calm, composed, but quietly grieved. Not for the money, not even for the treatment, but for how common this was, how familiar, how expected. Evan stood just beyond the galley, unsure whether to return to duty or stay still. His hands had been trembling earlier, but now they were still. Not because the pressure was gone, but because the truth had taken its place. The man in 17C, the one who hadn't looked like power, had taught him something Evan wouldn't forget. And it wasn't just about flights or seats or uniforms. It was about how easy it was to be silent in the face of wrongness, and how dangerous that silence could be. He stepped forward, then stopped, then stepped again. He found the courage to move closer to Keanu's seat. Keanu looked up. Evan cleared his throat quietly. "Sir," he said, I didn't say anything. When they moved you, I thought it wasn't my place." "It was," Keanu replied gently. Evan nodded. "Next time, I'll know." Keanu didn't smile. He just looked the young man in the eye and said, "That's all I needed." Then he turned back toward the window, his reflection faint in the curve of the glass. Outside, the clouds rolled slowly beneath them, but inside, something had shifted permanently. Natalie remained frozen on the jump seat, watching everything unfold with haunted stillness, her uniform still crisp, her makeup still precise. But the image she'd constructed had unraveled. It wasn't about grooming. It was about judgment, about the moments that defined you, not when you thought anyone was watching, but precisely when you thought no one was. She stared at her tablet, where a final alert had just come through. Crew member, conduct filed for review by owner authority, verdict pending. She locked the screen, closed her eyes, and breathed in the air that now felt too thin for comfort. At the front of the cabin, the first-class curtain no longer offered insulation. Not from the truth, not from consequence, not from the realization that every quiet decision she'd made on this flight had not only shaped someone else's experience, but had reshaped her own future. Back in seat 1A, Keanu sat still. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vindicated. He was resolved. Because some things should never have to be said out loud. But once they are, they should never be ignored again. Evan stood near the galley, his back pressed lightly against the cabinet, breath steadying. The buzz of the cabin had shifted hours ago from polished indifference to something heavier, weighty, with realization, steeped in quiet reckoning. Passengers had fallen into subdued stillness. He felt ashamed. He hadn't spoken when he saw Keanu get moved. He hadn't asked questions, he hadn't double-checked names. He had heard Natalie's order and simply obeyed it, assuming someone else had verified it. That someone else was in charge. That someone else would speak up if it wasn't right. Now he knew. That silence, his silence, wasn't neutral. It was complicity in a moment that didn't just reveal an error. It exposed a system. He took one step forward, then another. His shoes felt heavier than usual on the soft cabin carpet. He walked past rows of blinking screens and wide eyes, past passengers who had gone from curious to concerned to quietly contemplative. He reached seat 2A. Keanu looked up. Evan swallowed, took a breath, and steadied his voice. "Sir," he said softly, "I just wanted to say—" He paused. The words stuck like gravel. "I'm sorry. I didn't say anything when they moved you. I thought it wasn't my place." Keanu looked at him, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with the calm that had blanketed his presence the entire flight. "You weren't the problem," Keanu said, "but now you know." He let that settle. "So decide who you'll be next time." Evan nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "Thank you for what you did," he added, "for how you did it." Keanu nodded once, then returned his gaze to the window, the light shifting faintly across his reflection. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door clicked open. Captain Harris stepped out with crisp formality. His uniform was pressed, his expression controlled, but there was a tension beneath the surface, the weight of accountability from 38,000 feet. He approached seat 2A slowly, respectfully. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "Zurch has briefed us. I've been instructed to acknowledge the breach and issue a formal apology on behalf of the flight crew." Keanu looked up, expression calm but unmoved. "We regret the disruption," the captain continued, "and the treatment you received. We understand it was unacceptable." Keanu didn't respond right away. He let the words settle, quiet like dust. Then he replied, "Apologies are a start." The captain nodded. "But culture," Keanu said. "Culture is what happens when no one's watching." He folded his hands together. "So fix that." The captain stood straighter. "Yes, sir." He returned to the cockpit, the cabin now completely silent. Back near the galley, Bryce watched the exchange unfold. There was nothing left to hide behind. No policies, no procedures, no polished scripts. Just choices. And their cost. He turned his face away, not to escape it, but to finally see it for what it was. In row 4, a woman pulled her scarf tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't cold, she just didn't want to be seen. She'd been one of the first to make assumptions earlier in the flight. She hadn't spoken to Keanu, hadn't mocked him aloud, but she had judged. She had leaned toward her husband and whispered about how he didn't look like a first-class passenger. Now she couldn't meet his eyes. Beside her, her husband slowly closed his laptop. The financial article he'd been reading was now replaced by a bold headline. "Airline apologizes after kicking owner from seat 1A, clause 7C, activated." He swallowed hard and tapped the screen off. His silence, like so many others, had allowed everything to unfold. A few rows back, Martin Langford had stopped checking his phone. The markets were still falling, but the bigger loss was evident in his own posture. His back was no longer straight. His jaw, once clenched in arrogance, now sagged in disbelief. The seat he had taken, so easily, so confidently, felt like it was shrinking around him. He turned slightly, maybe to say something, maybe to offer some defense, but Keanu didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Martin leaned back, defeated. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because someone had taken his power away, but because, finally, he understood he'd never really earned it. Near the curtain, Natalie remained seated, her tablet dark now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent years managing elite clients, enforcing policies, ensuring the premium experience. But no one had ever asked her what that meant until today. She'd enforced comfort without compassion, status without discernment, protocol without humanity. And now, she was the face of it all. The photo of her dismissing Keanu, her body language stiff, her expression unreadable, had gone viral. Some defended her, most didn't. The damage wasn't just online. It was in her own realization of how deeply she had misread the moment. She thought of every passenger she'd ever reassigned without a second glance, every boarding pass she'd scanned without checking, more than the clothes and the posture. What she felt now wasn't just fear. It was awakening. Up front, Keanu opened his notebook one final time. Not to write a speech, not to draft a plan, just one more line. He wrote it slowly, carefully, then closed the cover. From the cockpit, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Zurich. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are secure. Estimated arrival in 24 minutes. The cabin lights dimmed again. The clouds outside began to part. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every passenger aboard Flight 447 had witnessed more than turbulence. They had watched a culture come undone and start to rebuild. Keanu leaned back. He hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't demanded apologies. He had demanded awareness. And for the first time in years, an entire cabin had found it, through one man's quiet refusal to stay quiet. The wheels touched down on the Zurich tarmac with a soft, measured bump. A hush filled the cabin, thicker than the descent's silence. No one clapped, no one cheered, no one reached for their phones to take videos of the landing. It wasn't that they had forgotten. It was that something about celebration now felt wrong. Flight 447 had begun like every other luxury international journey, polished, curated, confident. But it was landing as something else entirely, a vessel that had carried more than passengers. It had carried assumption, silence, and the price of both. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, a quiet chime sounded. Seat belts clicked softly, passengers stirring as though waking from a collective spell. But eyes still flickered cautiously across rows. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Keanu remained in seat 1A, upright and calm. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance at the curtain or the crew. His presence now wasn't just noticed, it was undeniable. At the rear of the plane, Natalie sat on the jump seat, her back straight but her shoulders heavy. The final alert had come through moments ago on her crew tablet, and for debrief immediately, upon arrival. Beside her, Bryce didn't speak. He had nothing left to say. His screen had gone black after the final compliance code locked out crew editing permissions. He had tried to submit a correction report, a last-minute defense. But the system had frozen. The plane pulled up to the gate, and a ground team rolled the air bridge into place. Outside, the terminal windows gleamed with early evening light. But waiting just beyond the glass was not the usual crowd of flight staff. There were no attendants with signs, no greeters with flowers. Instead, 3 sharply dressed executives in black suits stood silently near the arrival gate, flanked by 2 security officers. They weren't there for photographs. They were there for answers. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off, but no one moved. Passengers glanced around, unsure whether to stand, unsure whether to speak. The silence was its own judgment now. After a pause, a low voice came over the intercom. "Captain Harris, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Zurich. Please remain seated. We are holding the front cabin doors at this time." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but none of the usual polish. No goodbyes, no smiles, no thank you for flying with us. Just quiet hands gathering safety cards and empty cups. A moment later, the cockpit door opened. 2 men stepped through in dark suits. Internal affairs. One turned toward the rear galley. "Miss Green," he said evenly, "you'll need to remain on board for debriefing." Natalie stood slowly, her lips pressed together. She didn't argue, she didn't ask why. She just nodded and sat back down. The second officer turned to Bryce. "Sir, same for you." Bryce nodded once, eyes empty. The first officer then looked down the aisle. "Mr. Langford." Martin didn't respond. His face was pale, his hands had stopped shaking. Now they were just clenched. He didn't make eye contact as he stood. "You'll be escorted to the terminal." Martin blinked. "Escorted? Your privileges with Atlantic Air and all affiliate carriers have been revoked." Martin's lips parted, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, no one around him cared what he had to say. Martin gathered his coat in silence. The once confident man who had claimed seat 1A without hesitation now moved like a shadow of himself. He followed the officers toward the front, every eye on the plane following him. Not out of curiosity, out of recognition, out of quiet justice. No one said goodbye. No one offered sympathy. He exited the aircraft like a man stepping out of a dream and into consequences. Outside the plane, the Zurich terminal buzzed faintly with corporate activity, but around Gate 14, a circle had been drawn. 3 Atlantic Air executives stood with tablets in hand, files ready, eyes sharp. When Martin stepped into their space, one of them raised a hand. "Mr. Langford, this is not a conversation. This is notice." He tried to speak, but again the words failed. Behind him, Natalie and Bryce remained seated on board. Internal Affairs stood nearby, not with threats, but with presence. This wasn't a takedown. It was a reckoning. A system correcting itself. In the cabin, the passengers waited. Not out of impatience, but in quiet deference. They weren't waiting for the door to open. They were waiting to understand what it meant now to fly with awareness. Finally, the intercom chimed again. A simple instruction from the captain. You are now free to disembark. But still, no one moved. Until Keanu stood. Only then did the rest follow. Not in a rush, not in urgency, but in measured, thoughtful movement. As he stepped off the aircraft, Keanu passed Evan, who was standing by the galley door. Evan's hands were folded behind his back, his chin slightly lifted, eyes steady despite the emotion building behind them. Keanu paused for just a breath. "Sir," Evan said softly. "Thank you." Keanu didn't nod, he didn't smile, he simply said, "Next time someone's silence feels wrong, say something." Evan nodded. His answer was quiet, but certain. "I will." As Keanu stepped into the jet bridge, the light from the terminal washed over him. The world outside didn't yet know the full story, but the people inside that plane would carry it with them long after the flight was forgotten. Back inside, Natalie stared forward. Her posture had crumbled slightly, but her resolve had started to form. She knew what she'd done. But more importantly now, she knew what she'd become. And she had a choice. The weight of silence no longer comforted her. It confronted her. Outside, cameras hadn't gathered. But meaning had. Keanu Reeves, in simple jeans and a jacket that had blended into the boarding crowd hours earlier, now walked alone through the terminal. No guards, no entourage, no headlines trailing him. But in his wake, something had shifted. And behind him, the aircraft that once judged him now sat grounded in silence, waiting not just for its next takeoff, but for its own transformation. The doors to the aircraft opened. Fresh Zurich air filtered faintly through the cabin as the jet bridge connected with a slow metallic hiss. But inside, no one rushed to stand, no eager reaching for overhead bins, no polite chatter. The silence that had landed with them now lingered like a shadow. Keanu remained seated in 1A, his posture unchanged. He watched as rows ahead of him slowly began to empty, passengers rising one by one, subdued and thoughtful. A few nodded toward him as they passed, some offering small glances that tried to carry an apology without words. Others didn't look at all. Each carried the same realization. They had witnessed something bigger than turbulence. In row 4, the woman who had whispered earlier gathered her coat without speaking. Her husband said nothing as he followed behind her. Even their footsteps felt quieter. Not from shame, but from a changed understanding. Behind them, a young man in a hoodie gave Keanu a nervous, respectful nod. He had recognized him too late, just like everyone else. But he hadn't forgotten the moment when he overheard the woman in first class say, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." Now he knew who had always belonged and who never did. As the line thinned, the mother and son who had sat near Keanu passed slowly. The boy looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His stuffed lion dangled loosely from one hand, and in the other, he held the notebook his mother had given him to draw in. On the page, he had scribbled a cartoon plane. In seat 1A, he had drawn a little stick figure with a black jacket and a calm smile. The mother gave Keanu a soft nod, lips pressed in thanks she couldn't put into words. Keanu nodded back. When the last of the passengers had exited and the aisle was finally clear, he rose slowly, stretching his legs. He moved with the same unhurried stillness he had shown when he boarded, but now every eye that remained on the plane followed him with quiet reverence. He paused near the galley where Evan stood, waiting respectfully. Keanu looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said simply. Evan blinked. Keanu leaned in slightly. Next time someone's silence feels wrong, say something. Evan nodded hard, throat tight. I will. Keanu placed a hand gently on Evan's shoulder, then continued toward the exit. At the jet bridge, the polished metal reflected a small group waiting at the terminal entrance. Among them stood Lena Caro, Atlantic Air's newly appointed Vice President of Crisis Management. She wore a dark blazer, sharp heels, and a lanyard with a gold-embossed badge. Her expression was tightly rehearsed. She stepped forward the moment she saw Keanu. Mr. Reeves, he didn't stop. On behalf of Atlantic, I want to personally extend our... Keanu walked past her. No nod, no pause, no acknowledgement, because this moment didn't belong to apologies. It belonged to truth. And truth didn't need PR language or branded regret. What mattered had already been said. What needed to change was already underway. Lena remained standing just outside the arrival corridor, stunned by his silence. Her apology hovered in the air, unanswered. Around her, members of the Atlantic Air ground team exchanged uncertain glances. No one knew what to do next. No press releases had prepared them for this moment. No manual had taught them what to say when the man who owned nearly half their company walked by without a word. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to issue threats. The silence behind him said more than any speech could. He had spoken with action. He had made the system feel its own weight. At baggage claim, no handlers rushed to pull his suitcase aside for priority. No staff fumbled to recover lost time. Keanu waited quietly, alone by the carousel. His scuffed leather satchel rolled toward him, unmarked, unglamorous, just as he had boarded with it. He picked it up and turned toward the exit. Outside the terminal, the evening light was soft. Zurich felt quieter than usual, though perhaps it was only in contrast to the echo left on Flight 447. Keanu paused at the curb, looking out over the parked cars, then up at the glass facade of the airport. Somewhere behind those walls, a company was breaking, not because of one mistake, but because of what it revealed. In a back room on the second floor, Natalie sat across from two compliance officers. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She had been asked 3 times already why she reassigned the seat without confirming the name. Each time her answer changed slightly, each time her voice trembled a little more. Bryce was in a different room, alone with a company lawyer. His tablet had already been confiscated. His responses too were shifting. There was no defense left, only hindsight. Downstairs in the executive transport lounge, Martin Langford sat slumped in a leather chair, flanked by 2 security officers and a quiet representative from investor relations. He'd been instructed not to leave the airport without formal clearance. He wasn't angry anymore. He was numb. His phone buzzed again, another fund pulling out, another partnership dissolving. For once, he had no snide remark to offer, no biting commentary. He had been removed from his seat, not by force, but by the weight of his own arrogance. Back outside, Keanu Reeves stepped into a waiting car. No limo, no cameras, just a black sedan with tinted windows. The driver didn't speak as Keanu climbed in and set his bag beside him. As the door closed, Keanu took one last look at the airport, out of the building, at what it now represented. This wasn't about revenge. He hadn't humiliated anyone. He had simply revealed them. He had pulled back the curtain and let the truth step into the aisle. Because sometimes power doesn't scream. Sometimes real power walks quietly out the door, after teaching the entire world what silence can cost. And then it drives away, leaving behind the noise it never needed. 3 days after the now infamous Flight 447, a quiet ripple began online, not from a celebrity account or major news outlet, but from a junior flight attendant named Evan Mitchell. The post was a photograph, a handwritten letter on plain-lined paper. At the top, in careful block letters, it read, "The cost of silence." The note began simply, "My name is Evan. I was part of the cabin crew on Flight 4747 from JFK to Zurich. I didn't speak up when a mistake was made. A mistake that wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity. Keanu Reeves was moved from first class not because he lacked status, but because too many of us thought status came with a look, a style, a set of assumptions. I didn't say anything. I thought it wasn't my place. But now I know silence has a price. The next paragraph detailed his own experience as a new crew member, his fear of breaking chain of command, and how he had quietly observed prejudice masquerading as protocol many times, but had never acted. Until now. Then came the part that made headlines. I am pledging 6 months of my salary to launch a fund for crew members who face retaliation, discrimination, or pressure to stay silent. Because silence isn't neutral. It's protection for the wrong people. The post ended with a sentence that would be shared around the world. If you've ever said nothing when you should have said something, now is the time to speak. Evan didn't tag anyone, he didn't link his employer, he didn't even mention Keanu by name again. But he didn't need to. The image went viral within an hour. First on Twitter, then Reddit, then Instagram. By the end of the day, the cost of silence was trending in 6 countries. On LinkedIn, aviation professionals began resharing it with commentary. Airline union leaders weighed in. Veteran pilots and former flight attendants posted their own stories under the same tag. Times they had looked the other way, or worse, stayed silent out of fear. The next morning, a quiet update appeared on Evan's post. Not from him, but from Volta Capital. A screenshot of a transfer confirmation. $250,000 0 cents deposited into the newly formed EM Fund for Ethical Crew Advocacy, matched tenfold by the firm that had once moved stock markets in silence. The post didn't say Keanu Reeves. It didn't have to. The confirmation bore the name of the fund, the original donation source, and a quiet signature. Authorized by K. Charles. Airline employees around the world began tagging each other beneath the post. Read this. Let this be a shift. This is what accountability looks like. But it wasn't just crew who reacted. Passengers began sharing their own experiences, being ignored, being moved, being misjudged in terminals and cabins. Stories poured in from across the globe. Men and women of every background, every age. One post read, "He moved my father to the back of the plane because they assumed he couldn't afford the seat. He was wearing his veteran cap." Another, "Eddie told me my dress was too casual for first class. I had just come from burying my mother." Evan's letter didn't just open a conversation. It opened a floodgate. As the days passed, the letter found its way into news segments and morning talk shows. Anchors read excerpts aloud. Editors published full transcriptions. A handwritten note, raw and personal, had ignited a global conversation about dignity, protocol, and the hidden culture of silence in professional spaces. In classrooms, teachers used it to discuss ethics. In corporate offices, HR teams printed it out and posted it on bulletin boards. In airline lounges, crews passed it around during breaks, folding the page softly like it carried something sacred. But something else was happening too. People began asking harder questions, not about Keanu, not even about Atlantic Air, but about the system. How many other injustices had been dismissed because someone stayed quiet? How many policies were built around comfort for the powerful and compliance for the vulnerable? What did it mean when silence became the norm, not the exception? Evan's letter had pulled something hidden into the light. He wasn't praised by everyone. There were critics, anonymous accounts called it performative. Some executives suggested he'd violated internal communications policy. But none of that stopped the momentum. Because the public had already decided the letter wasn't about Evan, it was about themselves. Across platforms, thousands began using the hashtag to confess their own moments of silence. A former hotel manager shared how she had once watched a guest be denied service for not dressing the part. A barista admitted she had given different levels of service depending on the perceived wealth of the customer. A marketing executive admitted he'd watched a younger colleague be sidelined in meetings without ever offering backup. They had all kept their mouths shut. Now they were opening their eyes. On day 4, Evan posted a quiet follow-up. It wasn't a new letter. It was a photo of the fund's first outreach, a travel voucher, lodging coverage, and legal support offered to a female crew member who had been placed on leave after reporting a pilot's misconduct the previous year. The caption read, "No one stood up for her then. Now, she won't stand alone." That message sparked a new kind of response. Volunteers flooded the fund's inbox, offering legal support, mentorship, and donations. Other airlines began quietly reaching out, asking for guidance on how to handle internal change. A few even publicly pledged to adopt zero-tolerance protocols for retaliatory crew practices. Back at Volta Capital, a short internal memo was circulated to all employees. Silent ownership doesn't mean silent responsibility. Let this be the first of many changes. The memo was signed by Keanu Reeves. No press release followed. No spotlight interview. Just the work, quiet, deliberate, and ongoing. And Evan, who had once stood paralyzed in the aisle of Flight 447, was now standing taller than ever. He didn't get promoted. He didn't get a book deal. What he got was something better. A community and a legacy. The cost of silence was no longer a letter. It was a movement. One built not on shame, but on the choice to be better. And as the world kept flying forward, a single handwritten note kept reminding everyone who saw it. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's written in ink, folded gently, and passed from hand to hand. 6 weeks after Flight 447, the first quiet announcement appeared, not in a headline, but in a footnote on Volta Capital's internal philanthropy page. A new initiative had been launched, discreet, unfunded by sponsors, and entirely anonymous in its public attribution. It was called the 17C Initiative. No flashy campaign, no celebrity photo ops. Just a mission to restore dignity in service industries, one company at a time. The page described it simply as a platform for training, education, and ethical enforcement. It focused on how front-facing industries could do more than talk about equity. They could live it. Each participating company would agree to 3 core tenets: presence over pretense, respect over rank, and action over appearance. The name came from a seat, one that should have meant nothing, one that had become a mirror. Keanu never confirmed his involvement, but no one doubted it. Behind the scenes, Atlantic Air was changing too. Weeks of internal audits had revealed more than just one incident. Dozens of micro-prejudices, disguised as preference, seniority, or vague brand standards, had emerged in crew reports, hiring patterns, and passenger feedback. The executive board, now under heavy shareholder scrutiny, made sweeping changes. The first public move was symbolic but necessary, a leadership restructuring. Bryce, the flight manager, was quietly reassigned. Natalie, whose name had become a flashpoint on social media, resigned from her post with a carefully worded statement. It expressed regret, but never directly mentioned the word discrimination. Her statement was met with silence. No applause, no anger, just silence. Martin Langford, once a loud voice in the investor community, disappeared from public view altogether. Reports suggested he had liquidated several holdings and stepped back from public panels. His once thriving speaking career was over. He had not only misjudged a man, he had misjudged the future. In contrast, Evan's journey unfolded in the open. He didn't campaign for recognition, but when he was offered a new position as lead of Atlantic's ethics liaison team, he accepted with clarity, not as a reward for silence, but as a step forward from it. His first team meeting opened with one sentence: "I'm not here because I got it right. I'm here because I chose to get better." The room listened, and for once, it felt like they really heard. Across Atlantic's fleet, new protocols began to take shape. Crew retrained under the revised code developed with outside advisors and former passengers. The phrase, "presence over pretense," was printed at the bottom of every new employee badge, not as branding, but as a promise. Not to pretend to care, but to be present for the people who walked their aisles every day. Internal videos replaced polished airline reels with real stories. A former flight attendant who faced racism mid-flight, a gate agent who once corrected a bias in seat assignments, and Evan, standing humbly in front of a quiet camera, sharing what it meant to act too late, but still act. Change wasn't fast, but it was steady. For every whisper that once said, "He doesn't belong here," a new voice was rising to say, "Everyone does." And 17C, the number, the seat, the symbol, had become more than a place on a plane. It had become a turning point. As the 17C initiative spread, other companies began to take notice. Quiet inquiries came in from hotel chains, cruise lines, and even financial institutions. Leaders weren't just asking how to avoid scandal, they were asking how to rewrite legacy. One airline CEO admitted privately, "We've been designing first-class cabins to separate, not to serve." The shift wasn't just operational, it was philosophical. Meanwhile, within Atlantic Air, the transformation moved from the top down, but more importantly, from the inside out. Flight crew evaluations were overhauled. Cultural empathy was prioritized as much as technical efficiency. And new hires went through immersive training led by educators, not marketers. Stories became part of the curriculum. Not just data. Stories of how dignity had once been denied. Stories of how people, even in silence, had remembered what was done to them. One instructor read Evan's letter aloud during onboarding. Not as a caution, but as a challenge. "What will you do," she asked the room, "when the aisle becomes a dividing line instead of a path?" The question stayed with them. In Zurich, a former first-class passenger wrote a letter to the airline. She hadn't said anything that day. She hadn't even looked up. But now, she admitted she felt the difference, not just in the seat, but in herself. She pledged to sponsor 3 crew members through the 17C program and asked only that her name remain unknown. Because anonymity didn't mean apathy. It meant humility. Back in New York, a small conference was held, not by Atlantic Air, but by a non-profit dedicated to workplace justice. Evan was invited to speak. He wore the same uniform he had worn on Flight 447, not to provoke, but to remember. He took the stage with shaking hands. "I thought I needed permission to do the right thing," he said. "Now I know silence is permission. And I won't give it again." His words were met not with thunderous applause, but with quiet stillness. The kind that says, "We've heard you." The kind that says, "It's our turn." Afterward, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. Her son had followed the Flight 447 story obsessively. He was 10 years old and had drawn a picture of Keanu walking down the aisle, with lightning in his footsteps. "Do you know what he called it?" she said, voice catching. "He called it, 'The Day They Found Out.'" Evan didn't know how to respond, so he just smiled, soft and real. Because yes, that was the day they found out. About power, about assumptions, about what happens when a man chooses not to shout, but to change the world by walking straight into it. Keanu never issued a statement. He never tweeted, never posted a video, never granted an interview. But his actions became a blueprint. And the 17C initiative, once just a seat and a story, had become a movement. A cultural restoration, one that didn't need heroes. Only humans willing to grow. And on the inside cover of every 17C training manual, printed in bold, unpolished font, was a single quote. Not from a CEO, not from a consultant, from Keanu Reeves. It read, "Respect isn't given by title. It's proven in silence when no one is watching, and you choose to act anyway." The morning was quiet at JFK's Terminal 5, the kind of quiet that settles before something meaningful. Most passengers walked by without noticing. A few glanced up at the gate number, thinking only of boarding times and overhead space. But those who stopped at Gate 17C saw something different. A black velvet cloth hung over a new plaque mounted near the gate's window. Security personnel lingered nearby, but there were no barricades, no red carpets, no fanfare. Just a few airline executives, a handful of crew members, and a circle of employees wearing updated uniforms, with a small embroidered symbol stitched into the lapel. A pair of silver wings, one side polished, the other deliberately left tarnished. The message was intentional. Not everything that shines is right, and not everything that looks worn is weak. Just before noon, a soft chime played over the intercom, and a familiar voice echoed through the terminal. It wasn't a celebrity. It wasn't scripted. It was Evan. He stood near the gate desk in full uniform, speaking into the mic. "Today isn't about a mistake," he said. "It's about what followed." He paused, breath steady. "It's about a seat, one that became a symbol, one we almost ignored. Today we remember why we won't ignore it again." With that, a young crew member stepped forward and lifted the cloth from the plaque. Underneath, etched in steel and shadowed in brushed bronze, were the words, "Courage doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply doesn't move." A quiet hum passed through the gate. No cheers, just stillness. Behind a set of tinted windows, separated from the event by design, a man in a charcoal jacket stood beside the terminal wall. A baseball cap shaded his eyes, and a pair of sunglasses hung loosely from the neck of his shirt. He didn't speak, he didn't wave, but he watched. Keanu Reeves had come, not as a guest of honor, not for acknowledgement, just to witness. He stood at a distance as the terminal staff took turns stepping up to the plaque. One touched it lightly with 2 fingers, another took a photo and whispered something under her breath. Even a janitor, holding a mop handle like a staff of pride, nodded toward it before moving quietly back to work. Keanu's gaze softened. It wasn't the plaque that moved him. It was what it meant. Because this wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't a celebration of exposure. It was a reminder, one that didn't need his face. Across the gate's overhead monitors, a short reel played. No audio, no dramatic narration. Just black and white images from that flight, spliced with phrases like "service is not status," "respect is not reserved," and "every aisle tells a story." At the end of the video, one sentence faded in slowly. "And sometimes, justice boards quietly, then never gets off." In the crowd, Evan stepped back and took his place beside the newer crew. None of them looked older than 25. Yet their eyes carried something heavier now. Something stronger. Not training. Awareness. They had read the stories. They had watched the footage. And now they carried the responsibility of not repeating it. Across the terminal, a small boy wandered up with his mother. He stopped in front of the plaque and tilted his head, reading the inscription slowly. His mother gently tugged his arm, but he pointed. "Mom, is that about the guy from the plane?" She nodded. "Yes. It's about the guy who didn't shout. He just waited and changed everything." The boy nodded, then leaned closer to the metal, his fingers tracing the outline of the words. Keanu watched them from his place by the window. He didn't move, didn't step forward, but his eyes glistened. Nearby, a former Atlantic Air executive leaned over to the newly appointed Diversity and Culture Officer and whispered, "We used to reward silence differently." The officer replied, "We still do, but now we reward the right kind." In the background, the usual terminal noises resumed. Rolling luggage, boarding announcements, coffee cups clinking. But Gate 17C felt different. Not quieter, just heavier, like the air itself remembered. After the crowd began to thin, Keanu stepped forward once, only for a moment. He approached the plaque alone. No cameras, no introduction, no entourage. He looked down at the words, "Let the silence stretch," and then reached into his jacket. From a small inner pocket he pulled out a worn silver pen. It looked ordinary, but it wasn't. It was the same pen he had written with during Flight 447, the one used to take notes in seat 17C, the one that had recorded every microslight, every expression, every moment of silent judgment, a witness made of ink and weight. He bent slightly and placed the pen in the small groove carved at the base of the display. It fit perfectly. No inscription, no plaque, just presence. He stepped back, nodded once, and turned away. That was the only proof he left behind. A crew member noticed and walked up after he had gone. She stared at the pen, eyes wide, then looked toward where the man had stood. But by the time she turned, he was gone. He had boarded no flight. He had given no speech. He had left a story behind, not a signature. From that day forward, Gate 17C became more than a number. It became part of every new hire's orientation. Trainees would stand before the plaque in uniform, and the instructor would say, "This isn't about policy, it's about presence." They were told to read the inscription out loud, one by one, not as a chant but as a vow. And if you flew through JFK and looked closely, you'd sometimes see a crew member pause near that wall, brush their fingers across the edge of the plaque, and walk on, just a little straighter. Not because someone famous sat in 1A once, but because someone decent sat in 17C and didn't let it slide. This wasn't just a story about wealth. It wasn't even about power. It was about what you do when you have it, and whether you choose to keep the sky small for yourself or make it wide enough for others to rise. The man had said nothing that day, but the world had heard him anyway. The rooftop was unremarkable. No designer furniture, no string lights, no rooftop bar soundtrack humming in the background, just gravel, a rusted access door, and the sound of wind brushing against the city's edge. But Keanu Reeves sat there like it was a cathedral. The folding chair beneath him creaked slightly as he shifted his weight. In his hands rested the worn leather journal, its edges softened by time. The final page lay open in his lap, the last line inked just moments ago in a hand as calm as the sky above him. Justice at 38,000 feet is still justice. He read it again, not to admire the words, but to revisit the stillness that birthed them. No grand speeches, no vindictive celebration, just a quiet, personal truth set down in ink. And that was enough. From this rooftop, the city shimmered beneath him like a living constellation. Glittering windows, glowing signage, the hush of tires on wet pavement. Life bustled below, but above it all, the air felt untouched, still, honest. He sipped from a thermos resting beside him. Chamomile, slightly cold now. Across from him sat an empty chair. Not because he expected company, but because it felt right to leave space. For memory. For legacy. For anyone listening who hadn't yet found the courage to speak. Keanu closed the journal slowly, pressing the leather strap across it with care. He laid it beside the thermos, then looked out across the skyline with eyes that weren't searching for anything, just remembering. The flight had landed days ago. The fallout had already begun. The news cycle had roared, the stock had tumbled, and the names Natalie Langford Class 7C had trended across every platform. And yet, Keanu had said very little, because he didn't need to. The people who needed to understand had already heard everything they needed. But that didn't mean the story was over. The rooftop door creaked open behind him. He didn't turn around right away. The footsteps were light, hesitant. Evan emerged quietly, still in uniform, carrying a paper bag and 2 warm drinks in cardboard sleeves. He paused at the sight of Keanu sitting so still in the wind. "I figured you might be up here," Evan said. Keanu gestured to the empty chair. "You brought tea?" "And grilled cheese, from the spot you like." Evan handed one over as he took his seat. For a while, neither spoke. The city whispered around them. Eventually, Evan broke the silence. 3 days ago, I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to question anything, that it wasn't my call to make. Keanu looked at him and said nothing, letting the words find their place. "But it was," Evan continued. "It was exactly my place, and I froze." "You didn't stay frozen," Keanu said. Evan nodded. "Yeah, but I still think about it every moment. That's how you make sure you don't forget." They sat again in silence, the kind that settles into your bones, not heavy but grounding. Keanu reached for the sandwich and took a bite, chewing slowly. Evan watched him. "Do you regret anything?" Keanu thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, because I didn't act to punish. I acted to remind." "Remind who?" Keanu's eyes scanned the skyline. Everyone who thought silence was safer than speaking. Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the steam from his tea curling toward the sky. The silence stretched again, but this time it carried warmth rather than weight. Keanu waited, sensing more behind Evan's furrowed brow. "I didn't think it would follow me like this," Evan said. "After the flight, I thought it would pass. But everywhere I go now, people recognize me. Not for what I did," he paused, "but for what I almost didn't." Emma said. Keanu nodded slowly. Recognition fades. Responsibility doesn't. Evan looked down at his hands, the tea cradled between them. "I keep asking myself what I would have done if it wasn't you. If it was just another man in a hoodie. If there hadn't been cameras or tweets." "And?" Keanu asked, voice low but steady. "I don't like the answer," Evan admitted. "That's why it matters," Keanu said. The wind picked up slightly. A distant siren sang over the city, brief and fading. Evan took a slow breath. "I saw what silence did to the cabin," he said. "How it infected everything. The looks, the dismissals, the way people clung to comfort like it was truth." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. He handed it to Evan without a word. Evan unfolded it. It was a handwritten quote. "Integrity is what you defend when it's inconvenient." He looked up, eyes meeting Keanu's. "Yours?" Evan asked. Keanu shook his head. "Someone better. I just remembered it." Evan folded the paper carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket like a keepsake. "I won't forget." They sat for a while longer, eating in slow, quiet bites, the city turning from steel gray to gold as the sun edged closer to the horizon. The sky above them had no memory of boardrooms or viral threads or gate assignments. It only knew light and wind and motion. Eventually, Evan stood. "There's a new crew orientation next week," he said. "They're naming the training module after your quote." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one you said to the captain, about culture." Keanu didn't react, but a small breath left his nose. Not a laugh, not a sigh, something in between. "They're calling it the 17C standard," Evan added. "Presence over pretense." Keanu looked out at the skyline. "Then teach it, right?" "I will." Evan hesitated at the door again. "You think it'll change anything?" Keanu turned toward him. "Change never starts loud, it starts in rooms like this, in questions like that." Evan nodded once and disappeared through the rooftop exit, his footsteps fading into the city's rhythm. Keanu stayed a few minutes longer. He opened the journal one last time, flipped to the final page, and ran his thumb over the words he had written hours ago. Justice at 38,000 feet is still justice. He closed the book. The camera pulls wide. The city stretches below. Lights blinking, stories unfolding. Somewhere down there, another decision waits. Another silence waits to be broken. A girl on a sidewalk holds her mother's hand. A man in a booth hesitates before speaking up. A teacher pauses before skipping over the uncomfortable chapter in the textbook. And above them all, on a rooftop few will ever notice, sits the man who reminded the world that quiet doesn't mean weak. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just remembered what silence used to cost. Comment, Prompt 1. Have you ever witnessed someone judged for how they looked, not who they were? Comment, Prompt 2. What story would you like to see next with Keanu Reeves?